Hello everyone, welcome to Knowledge India once again. In this particular video, we'll try to understand that how different types of AWS policies work together. So I'm sure you have looked at different types of policies like identity-based policies, resource-based policies, permissions boundaries, service control policies, etc. Right? So the idea is to try and make it simple for you to understand it, that when many of these come together, how would they work? So I want to start this by asking you a question. So there, in the first scenario, we have an AWS account 1, and there's an IAM user with the name Gopal. Gopal has got only one policy attached to itself, which is EC2 full access. There's an S3 bucket in the same AWS account 1. The S3 bucket name is bucket 1. There is a bucket policy applied at this bucket level. It grants allow for S3 put object action to Gopal IAM user on this particular bucket here, and that's the bucket policy, right? So there are two questions here. Can Gopal upload a file to bucket 1? Number 2, can Gopal go ahead and download a file from bucket 1, right? And here is the second scenario for you. In an AWS account 1, there's an IAM user Gopal. Again, Gopal has only one policy attached, EC2 full access. That is the same thing. But here in the scenario 2, the S3 bucket is there in a different AWS account. Let's say the bucket name is bucket 2 and it is there in AWS account 2, right? And here also, again, the same bucket policy is applied at the bucket 2 level, and in that particular bucket policy, S3 put object action is allowed for Gopal IAM user, and Gopal IAM user is there from account 1, right? Here also the same two questions, that whether Gopal can go ahead and upload a file to bucket 2 or not, and can Gopal download a file from bucket 2 or not. So these are the questions which you need to answer, right? The only difference is in first scenario, the bucket and Gopal both are there in the same AWS account. In the second scenario, bucket and Gopal are there in two different AWS accounts. So go ahead and try to answer this in yes or no. Did you take an attempt? So let's try to understand the download scenario, right? Or the download question. The answer for that would be no. That I think is quite obvious. We can discuss the explanation as well, but the answer for that is no. Can Gopal upload a file to bucket 2? The answer there is no. But in case of bucket 1, yes, Gopal will be able to upload the file to bucket 1. Now, if that is what you answered, congratulations, good. And do you understand the reason behind that? If it is all clear, great. But if it is not, I would like to make it simple for you by explaining you how different types of policies come together and work. So if you look at AWS, within AWS, I would like you to kind of categorize it in your mind that there are policies which enable you to do something, and then there are certain policies which act as some sort of limits around what you can do, right? So at a broad level, you can categorize them in these two types of categories or in these two groups. So the type of policies which enable you to do something are identity-based policies and resource-based policies. So I hope you remember, identity-based policies are those policies which you go ahead and directly attach to an identity. Like identity could be an IAM user, an IAM role, right? And you may go ahead and attach a customer managed policy, an AWS managed policy, or an inline policy, right? So those are the identity-based policies which you directly attach to an IAM user or to an IAM role. And resource-based policies are those which you write at a particular resource level. For example, you may go ahead and write a bucket policy at S3 bucket level. You may go ahead and write an access policy at SQS queue level, right? So these are resource-based policies. Resource-based policies are of course not applicable for all the AWS resources. There are only a couple of AWS resources which actually support resource-based policies, right? So these are the two types of policies which actually enable you to do something. And then when you move ahead to permissions boundaries and service control policies, these two policies, they are actually not giving you any power or giving you any ability to go ahead and do something, but yes, they kind of restrict or limit you, right? This will become more clear if we move ahead and see this with an example, right? So let's try to see an example. Always remember that in any of these policies, you can write allow statements and deny statements both. And based on all our previous learning, we know that if you go ahead and write an explicit deny for any particular action, that explicit deny wins, right? Then, it will cancel out any other allow which has been written. So an explicit deny always wins. Remember that, right? So let's move ahead and try to take an example here. So there's a user Nicole, and Nicole has got an identity-based policy attached. Let's say it is EC2 full access, right? All of us know what is EC2 full access. And over and above that, there is a resource-based policy also written for Nicole. Of course, it should be written at some, let's say at an S3 bucket level. And in that bucket policy, some permission, or you can say certain actions have been allowed for Nicole. Let's say S3 put object and S3 get object. These two actions are allowed for user Nicole. I've mentioned here that for now, let's consider that we are only discussing allow statements, okay? Because of these two things, if you just try to imagine what type of actions can user Nicole go ahead and do. So Nicole would be able to execute all the EC2 actions because of the identity-based policy, right? And Nicole would also be able to go ahead and do certain actions on S3. What are those actions? Get object and put object. Whether Nicole would be able to do that on all the S3 buckets? Answer is no. Only on that particular S3 bucket where the bucket policy is mentioned or bucket policy is written, and that bucket policy is actually quoting user Nicole. Only on that particular bucket, user Nicole would be able to do get object and put object. I hope that part is clear. So what we understand is the identity-based policies and resource-based policies, they are giving the power to Nicole to go ahead and do something. Now, if we move ahead here, in this case itself, and let's say I will go ahead and attach a permissions boundary policy to Nicole. And in that particular permissions boundary policy, let's say I have allowed EC2 star and S3 star. And further, I've gone ahead and also, let's say, applied a service control policy from the top at the account level in which I have allowed AWS full access, right? So what happens, what sort of actions Nicole can go ahead and execute now after applying these two things? Even then, the result remains the same, right? So this part is understandable because you might say that, okay, in these permissions, boundaries, and service control policies, we are actually not denying anything. That's fine. Yeah, here this is like just allow is written. But what I want to explain you here is that please understand, out of these four things, the top two policies are actually responsible for empowering Nicole to do something, right? So let's say I go ahead and remove the identity-based policy and the resource-based policy, which was there, right? I've removed those policies, but these two are still applicable. Can Nicole go ahead and do something now? The answer is no. Nicole won't be able to execute any actions. Any EC2 or any S3 or any actions for that matter. Because you have to understand, when you are trying to evaluate the policies which are attached to a user or to a role, you have to evaluate it in this order, that first you need to see that what sort of policies are actually attached to the user, the identity-based policies. Then if there are, let's say, any resource-based policies, that also you consider. So these two policy types are actually responsible for allowing a user to be able to go ahead and do something, right? Over and above that, permissions, boundaries, and service control policies, they can go ahead and restrict few things. That's there. They can go ahead and restrict, but in the order of evaluation, try to evaluate it in that order. First, look at identity based policies, resource based policies, and after that, if there are permissions boundaries and service control policies also applied there, then go ahead and see what are they allowing or what are they restricting. You can look at it, right? So I hope that gives you some idea. Now we will show you a demo of this as well as we move ahead. Coming back to the question which we discussed earlier, in this question, if you see, of course, in both the scenarios, scenario 1 and 2, download will not work, right? Because S3 get object has not been granted anywhere. So that's why download will not work. That's understandable. But why is it happening that Gopal is able to upload a file when the bucket is there in the same account, but Gopal is not able to upload the file when the bucket is there in a different account? So the reason for that is, in the first scenario, the resource policy, basically the S3 bucket policy, what it does is it further adds to the permissions which Gopal currently has. So Gopal already has EC2 full access. Over and above that, whatever is allowed in the S3 bucket policy, those actions get added to Gopal. In the way, like when Gopal tries to execute that, it works because they both are there in the same account. The S3 bucket and Gopal both are there in the same AWS account. Whereas on the right hand side, in the scenario 2, what happens is, yes, S3 bucket policy is granting access to Gopal, but it is there in a different AWS account, right? So Gopal is there in account 1. So if Gopal has to initiate, right? If Gopal has to initiate S3 put object within account 1 itself, that action will be restricted if Gopal doesn't have such policies attached, right? Because if you see here in this scenario, Gopal doesn't have any S3 related permissions attached to itself. Gopal has got only EC2 full access attached, right? Hence, when Gopal tries to invoke S3 put object, immediately at the account 1 level itself, it gets restricted. So that's why if you have to make it work in the scenario 2, at least you will have to go ahead and attach S3 put object permissions to Gopal as an identity based policy, right? After that only Gopal will be able to invoke that action from here, and account 1 will allow it to happen. And then when that request reaches to the actual bucket, let's say the bucket 2, their bucket policy is written. So because of that, it will work. But if Gopal doesn't have any identity based permission for S3 actions, then Gopal will not be able to invoke itself that particular S3 action. That's the thing which you need to understand. If you haven't got it yet, what we'll do is we will now look at a demo, and I'll explain you this thing right in the console, and I'll recommend that you also go ahead and do it along with us and understand this, right? We'll take a simple example and explain this to you. You can see that I'm logged in to one of my AWS accounts. Just to remember this, let's call this account 115, right? And I also have another account, we'll call it 122, okay? 115 and 122, just to keep it simple. So in this particular AWS account, I've got user Gopal, and you can see user Gopal has got only 2 policies attached, EC2 full access and AWS Cloud Shell full access. I've just given this so that Gopal can go ahead and access Cloud Shell, right? Directly from the management console itself, we should be able to execute CLI commands. For that purpose, this one I've given. There are no S3 related permissions given to Gopal, okay? So this part is clear. Now what I'm going to do is, within this same account, right, there is an S3 bucket, which I've named as FMW115, right? I will go to its permissions, and you can see currently there is no bucket policy here, right? So if I go ahead and let's say try to do a put object currently to this particular bucket from user Gopal, of course it should not work, right? Post that, what we'll do is we'll come back and we will attach a bucket policy where we will give permission to user Gopal. So let's do that. I will go here. So here on the other screen, you can see on the right hand side, I have user Gopal logged in a different browser, and user Gopal, I've opened the Cloud Shell. Okay, so fine. What we can do is I will go ahead and just create a file. Okay, So there is a file here called test file. And what I'll do is, if I try to do AWS S3 CP, I'm just trying to copy, it will internally use put object. So I'll do AWS S3 CP test file and fmw115. I want to upload here. Let's see, it says upload failed because of course this permission is not there. Okay, now what we'll do is we will go here and we will just let me copy the ARN for user Gopal, and I'll go here and I'll say edit. Let's say add a new statement, and in the principal we'll say AWS. Okay, effect is allow. In actions I'll say S3 colon put object, right? And in the resource I will take this and I will put it here. Because it is on object, so I have to put /*, right? Because this is the bucket ARN. So I'm saying all the objects inside this, that's why I'm putting /*. Let's say save changes. Okay, so this is saved, right? This policy has come here. You can still see for user Gopal, there are no S3 related actions allowed. Okay, so now let us go here and we will run the last command once again. You can see it got uploaded, right? So if I come back here and I go to this particular bucket and I go to objects, I'll just refresh this and you will see test file got uploaded, right? So this is the first scenario which you saw where user Gopal was able to upload the file to this bucket even when user Gopal actually doesn't have any S3 actions allowed as part of that user's identity based policies, because this resource based policy allowed those actions. Because of that it worked. Now let's look at the second scenario where we will have a bucket in the other AWS account. So let me go here to the other AWS account. This is another AWS account, you can see here, and here I have a bucket called FMW122. Okay, now what I'll do is, again I'll come to bucket policy, I'll say edit. Well, in the meanwhile, of course, if I go ahead and try to run this at this point, this should not work, right? So it is not working. Now I will go ahead and add a new statement here, and in this I will say let me just pick user Gopal's ARN. All right, in action, I will say S3 colon put object, right? And in the resource, we'll put this thing. Okay, we'll say save. All right, so this bucket policy is updated. So whether Gopal would be able to upload the file to this bucket now, let's try and see. Gopal shouldn't be able to. You see, upload failed. I can try it again a couple of times just to be sure. Right, you can see upload is failing. Why so? This is scenario 2, right? Because currently if you go ahead and see for user Gopal, right, see here for user Gopal, there is no S3 related actions allowed as part of identity based policy. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and quickly add a permission here where I will allow user Gopal to be able to execute put object action for that particular bucket in the other account, right? So let me do that. Right, so we'll say add. Let's review this. We'll just say okay. All right, so now if you see, this particular policy is attached and it says allow S3 put object on this particular bucket, right? So let me go back to this particular screen now, and I'll go ahead and try to execute this once again, and let's see. You can see it got uploaded, right? So if we want, we can go ahead and verify this here in FMW122, which is a different account. You can see here test file has been uploaded. So I hope you got that part correctly. And the same type of behavior you will find if you go ahead and try to do with, let's say, an SQS queue. You can go ahead and create an SQS queue in the same AWS account, and you can have an SQS queue in the other AWS account, and the same type of behavior will be there. So a couple of things which I think we need to understand at last is that within an account, a resource-based policy adds the permission to the IAM identity or to the identity. It could be IAM user or role. It basically adds the permission to the identity, even when the identity does not have identity-based permissions for that action. You saw that in the first case, user Gopal did not have any S3 related actions. Even then, because a resource-based policy was allowing S3 put object, it worked, right? So it basically adds the permission to that particular identity within an account. But during cross-account access, that is not the case, right? That's why we saw just now in the demo that Gopal needs to have S3 put object added as an identity-based policy. Then only Gopal would be able to invoke that action from this account, and it will go. And then, of course, in the other account, bucket policy allows that particular action. That's why it is able to hit that bucket 2 or the bucket in the other account. But from the account 1, for Gopal to be able to invoke that, Gopal needs to have those permissions attached as an identity-based policy. The another important point here is permissions boundary does not interfere with the permissions granted by a resource-based policy. So I have done a detailed video already on permissions boundary. I'll just put the link in the description below if you want to go ahead and see that demo. One important thing to understand is that permissions boundary does affect what you can do based on the identity-based policies which you have, right? For example, let's say there's a permissions boundary attached to a user. In that, only EC2 star and S3 star is allowed, and that particular user has got RDS full access as well, right? So what will happen? The user will not be able to do RDS related actions because in permissions boundary, RDS is not allowed, right? But let's say, take another scenario. A user has a permissions boundary where only EC2 star is given, right? But this user has got an S3 bucket in that account, in the same account, whereas part of S3 bucket policy, some permission is given to this user. In that case, that S3 bucket policy, the permissions which this user is getting because of that S3 bucket policy, that will continue to work. Permissions boundary will not interfere with that. And that's where the point number 2 is written. Permissions boundary does not interfere with the permissions granted by a resource-based policy. Please understand that. And the last point is service control policies or SCPs. They are generally not targeted to a particular user or role. If you are, working on a use case where you are actually suggesting that we'll write an SCP in which we will specify a RN of a particular user or of a particular role, a specific one, then probably the approach you are taking is incorrect. The SCPs are generally written for a variety of resources or for a variety of identities, right? Or for multiple identities together. So you will generally write it for a complete group of resources or for a complete group of identities. You will never pinpoint one particular user or role in SCPs generally. So these are some of the things which I wanted to convey. I hope you understood this one. Please go ahead and try it if you have not done it already in your account, and please do watch the permissions boundary video as well. I hope you learned something from this video. If you did, please go ahead and like this video and share it with someone in your circle. They may also get benefited, and look at our video description for other useful playlists like this. Okay, we'll meet again very soon. Thank you for your time and patience, and continue to learn by doing it practically.